memoir is something that so many of our writers want to write. And I'm curious as to the common errors for like what you don't want to see again in a memoir, because I'm sure you have to pass on a lot. It's a very tough market. So what do you find yourself repeatedly saying to memoirists who are pitching you for their agents?
I might be different than other editors. I think of memoir as like, what is it for? Like, what is the point of the memoir? Because if it has a point and a perspective, and it's like, and again, that's not like bullet points in the chapter. That's not it have like it being some political polemic, but if it's just telling a sad story to tell a sad story, or a happy story, what is sort of the mission of the book? I do think memoir is the most like fiction, and I don't mean facts. I mean about the read. So of any nonfiction, the read of memoir is most important. It has to be beautifully written, and you need to think about the most pivotal moments and pull everything else away. So if you're writing like this detail of your dad and it's getting, like, and then the neighbor and the neighbor's cousin, like it's like, what are the most pivotal points? If you were plotting a novel, and I don't want to speak too far into this because I am not a fiction editor, but like if you're plotting a novel, what are those most critical points? And then can everything else come out?
Mm. I like the way you say that. We often tell people to strive for cinematic in telling memoirs, like it's got to be as almost as action packed as a movie. I mean, it could, we have to see that scene by scene. But that's actually very new advice and helpful for us to tell memoirists, because it's just so difficult when you have this like life story you want to share the message, especially if it's about affliction and mental health, which so many books coming to market are about. Like, what is the new point that it's funding? And if people don't know you, if people don't know who you are.
Yeah. I just actually, I mean, I had that moment recently with an author who's writing more like prescriptive nonfiction book, but she's using her own story as what we call the through line, right? Mm-hmm. So that's like, and she was like, in this period, like after this, really tough moment, it was kind of quiet. Like I did this one thing socially, and sometimes that was the only thing. And like for like 2 or 3 years, sort of rebuilding part of her life. And I was like, we don't need to know. We need to know that gist. Like we need a moment of that, but we don't need all of those 3, 4 full years. And she's like, oh, great. Oh, that solves a lot. Right. And so I think in some ways it's really like giving some authors permission or releasing you from that of like, oh, right. Like sometimes this small part of your life is going to have a bunch of those moments, and that's okay. Right. It's like thinking about how to, it's like the scenes of what are the scenes of the movie and what are the most important moments.
And the most memorable, right? Which also is great self-help, because it's unlikely you're going to remember the 90,000 things you learned in the books by this author, but you will remember one that changes your life.
Yeah,
potentially. So on that note, is there a memoir that you acquired at any point in your career, or one you recently acquired that's forthcoming? Like, why'd you fall in love with that project? Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just published this book from someone who has no platform. It's called Bully Market. It's by Jamie Fiore Higgins, and she was a managing director at Goldman Sachs. She worked there for 20 years, and we don't have books from inside Goldman, so it's like a big reveal in that way, but also she kept very detailed journals, and she's telling the story of, despite Goldman Sachs having these very impressive statistics and press releases, the culture inside is really different and very discriminatory, and she had her own really quite extraordinary story and lots of details. So from like her boss telling her that despite like she shouldn't be breastfeeding at like pumping at work because it's a distraction, and her colleagues leaving a cow on her desk and mooing at her, to like having this incredible family leave, and she could take all this time but being expected to be on calls every single day for work, and then sort of being sent on very extensive work travel trips the second day she's back. I mean,
Right.
a colleague's throwing her up against the wall and choking her, like lots and lots of stories. And I fell in love with this partly because I think we're in a place in society where companies know they have to change and are talking a certain talk, but the reality and the culture and what they're enforcing or not is very different. And so those two are not connecting. And if it's happening at Goldman Sachs, it's happening sort of everywhere. And to shed a light on this, including at this elite institution no one knows much about.
That's good. Because in that case, as you said, there was kind of this missing platform piece in the way you might be traditionally evaluated as a self-help expert. There's not a huge social following because she works at Goldman. And sometimes, finance insiders will not have that social following because it's, contrary to the nature of their work, but it's inside the ivory tower that no one can access. And I love your point that if it's happening there, it's happening everywhere. So it's a big story. What's one word of advice, or you can give several words of advice to to writers trying to break in today?
It's easy when you're trying to get an agent and a book deal that becomes your reader. That's the goal, right? It's like, oh, I'm here to get an agent, then I'm here to get an editor and book deal. And I want to make sure we never lose we should, every single moment of this should be aligned toward the reader and how to get the word out, but also how you're connecting with the reader. Who are the readers we're trying to get to? How will someone going about their business and have no idea who you are or what this idea that does not exist in the world yet, right? How will they be turned on by this or not? How will they find out about it? How will they be excited about it? But also what is the idea? What are you connecting to? What are you how are you touching people's hearts and minds, helping them, whatever it is, right? That the reader becomes you never lose sight of the reader. And I think it's easy in this part of the process to be oh, the agent is the goal. Then the publisher is the goal, right? And then suddenly the reader is later, where it's always been about the reader.
Interestingly, though, and maybe this applies to you too. I love an author who will give me a healthy debate and a challenge. I like to be challenged by authors I take on to say, "Who's your reader?" We have that discussion together, and then they tell me, actually, my reader is this. A question I'll often ask authors who speak is what's the number one question you're asking?
Yeah,
it may not be the story of your business that you want to tell, and your story of addiction and your story of mental health. It may be how do I innovate in my company? It's a pretty good sign if you're speaking 40, 50 times a year that you're getting a certain, what does that person look like? What's her job? What's the question you're asking? So I love ultimately to hear instead of the goal of finding an agent, it's to be thinking about that reader and wanting to serve that reader at the beginning of the process is so helpful. All right.
And oftentimes the reader isn't who people might assume, right? I Portfolio had done this really smart thing where they, when I was there, I think it was another editor, Nikki's idea to pull social media, people who had posted our books, photos with our books, and we put a wall of them, of all these different people, to show, one, the readers reading our books and who we're impacting, but also I was really surprised by how young, how old, how everything, right? It was just really exciting. So I think it's helpful, especially if you're thinking of what your idea is and how to get to market, thinking through who the readers you're trying to reach are and how to do, how you do that. And not just the platform and positioning and marketing publicity is important, but also in the idea and book itself, and how, what problem are you trying to solve? And how is it wedded to your expertise, especially for first-time authors?
Sometimes it's a fabulous memoirist and there's this great story and this great writing, and they don't have any social media following, but they are connected to memoirists just like them that have bigger names. So there are all those ways. From an online perspective, though, when you're looking at social media, what are those kinds of books, and what can be the most important of those platforms? Maybe you don't have one in mind. We often think about an email list as still carrying a lot of weight. So So first of all, like, what are the kinds of books that require the social media following?
That's a good question. I don't know if the require is the way I would think about it. I think it's just an equation. If you're writing about like how to have a huge social media following,
Right.
and you have zero, like that's going to be a concern. But I think one, if we just dive into the social media itself, like the engagement sometimes is more important than follower count, which is actually sort of where your email list that you just mentioned comes in. Because often if people are signing up to receive your emails and reading your emails and interacting, that one, I always love when people are like looking to you for your writing, right? Like it's a good sign, and they're engaging in that way, right? And so that is great for an email list. I sometimes these things change and quickly. We're living through some sort of possible Twitter shift. And even there's recent articles about email lists. So like who, like in some ways, like I never get tied to one specific thing of like, you must be on Twitter. Twitter is historically where a bunch of journalists live. So like, if that's a huge audience for you, and that's like, and you're connected in that world, like great, right? Like, so it's just kind of what we're looking at is when we get a proposal, just looking at what the reality is and where those connections are, what like who the author is, who they know, what like how credentialed they are, like what like the connection to the idea, and really then assessing if that idea and how we can get it out and the word out, like we think there's enough there.
Right. Okay, good. And you answered about the big idea. You gave me some great language for like how you think about big idea. Can you think of a story or like an example of one of your authors where the pitch alone comes in from an agent, you put everything down, you're like, this idea seems so big. And then it can turn out to be a book you bought or not. But do you have an example of that you can tell us about?
One of my favorite moments is finding a gap in the marketplace, right? Like where no book has gone before, or not for a very long time, right? So when I came back to book publishing, I had been reading Julie Zhu, her Medium post. I had tried to get her to teach a Skillshare class because it had been on design and
TSU. I don't know her name. Julia
ZHUO. The Making of a Manager is her book, which
okay, got it. I do know the book title.
So I was reading her Medium post, and she was mostly writing about design. And I found myself, even though I'd been managing for a while, like that I was really gravitating toward how she talked about going from intern to VP and those steps, right? And when I came back to publishing, I was like, oh my gosh, she has. Like there was at the time 0 books for first-time managers. This book, The First 90 Days, which is actually for executives of like when you get a big new job. And I realized how ludicrous is this, that we put humans in charge of other human beings. Most people leave their job because of a bad boss. And so often we're just replicating the bosses we've had, good or bad, right? And that there was an opportunity to do better. So my colleague and I actually worked with Julie Zhu on this book. And I was like, you could do a design book, but you're writing and really helpfully on becoming a first-time manager and that trajectory. And Julie was into it and down for it. And we worked with her agent, and we like the 4 of us became this incredible team, and she published The Making of a Manager, and it's done beautifully. And I think she's also helped a ton of people, and it's like a really great book.
In today's age of publishing, people used to come in for meetings, right? Into the office, used to fly in and take those meetings. Meetings are never a guarantee of a deal. Now it's really common to just meet with a bunch of editors on Zoom if the editor is interested in your project. So in thinking about that process a little more, like what are the key things you're looking for when you take a meeting with an author?